So let's go ahead and dive into today's lecture. In preparation for today's topic, I had you read a chapter from this book here, Theology and Creed in Sunni Islam. And that chapter was a general discussion of Sunni theology. And so it explored a number of doctrines, but of course, for the purposes of today's lecture, I wanted you to have some understanding about the theological issues at play when it comes to the Quran. It's one thing for Muslims to say the Quran is the word of God. You say, okay, it's the word of God. But it's another thing to try and explain what exactly that means. What does that mean? Does that mean that what we hold in our hands and what we human beings recite, that we are manifesting the word of God? Is it part of God? Is it something God created, like the earth, like the universe? What's the nature of revelation? For example, was Muhammad inspired to compose the Quran? Or was this something that word for word, letter for letter was dictated to him? Right? These are all things we have to work out when it comes to the Quran. And theology can get pretty darn complicated. It can get really complicated and frustrating at the same time. So we're going to go through some of the theology that exists in Islamic thought. We'll focus on the Sunnis. We'll talk a little bit about the Shia as well. But mainly we're going to focus on the Sunnis. And as we proceed through this lecture, you'll see it's going to start to get more complicated, more frustrating as we go on. But I think it'll be helpful nonetheless. So let's start off with a single verse of the Quran. This is found in Surah 42. We know from our previous studies and lectures that there are 114 surahs of the Quran as put together by Uthman in the mid-7th century, what we call the Uthmanic Codex. And this ayah from Surah 42 states, "And it is not befitting a human being that Allah should speak to him except by revelation," and there we have the Arabic word wahi, "or from behind a partition," and here the Arabic word used is hijab, which is a word that people more commonly use to refer to the headscarf, "or that he sends a messenger," and the Arabic word here is rasul, which is derived from the verb rasala, to send, to reveal by his permission what he wills. Indeed, he is most high and wise. Okay, so here the Quran is talking about how Allah speaks to humanity through wahi, through revelation. So let's talk about the Muslim conception of wahi, of revelation, the means through which the one God, Allah, communicates to his creation, to humanity. So as we look at the works of great Muslim scholars, ulama, over the centuries, and we talked last time about the scholars who are considered to be the chief interpreters of the Quran last time and the methods they use, their knowledge of texts like the Hadith in trying to understand the Quran, for example, understanding the asbab al-nuzul, the historical context of a verse. And through that knowledge, they might have some understanding of what verses abrogate what other verses, so on and so forth. Well, the scholars in their writings talk about the existence of three primary modes of divine revelation to humanity. That one type of revelation we could describe as divine inspiration. So divine inspiration here is like a general idea, some general guidance, but not something which is dictated word for word, letter for letter. Right? It's as if God, plants an idea or a directive in someone's mind and they carry it out. This type of revelation, according to Muslim scholars, may also take the form of dreams, that Allah may communicate with certain human beings through dreams. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about dreams in Islamic thought. There's a There's a famous hadith that says that Satan can't impersonate the Prophet Muhammad. So if you encounter Muhammad in a dream, then you've really encountered him. Which is kind of a dangerous idea, right? Because anyone who says, I had a dream about Muhammad and he told me to do this. Oh, let's hope it was something good. Another type of revelation is divine dictation through a partition, or to use the Quranic term, the hijab. And a classic example of divine dictation through a partition would be the burning bush. The story of Moses and the burning bush. That Moses, or Musa in the Quran, is in the land of Midian. He's fled Egypt, and he's attracted to this burning bush, this mysterious burning bush in the wilderness where the flame isn't consuming the bush. And out of that burning bush comes this voice. So the burning bush is the partition, the intermediary through which the revelation is received by Moses. And of course, he's commanded to go back to Egypt. And then we have divine dictation through an angel. So instead of a partition like the burning bush, through an angel, like Sayyidina Jibreel, Saint Gabriel. Gabriel, in the Christian tradition, is the angel of the Annunciation. We read in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that Gabriel came to the Virgin Mary to inform her that she would indeed give birth to this miraculous son, although she was a virgin. Well, that story is part of the Islamic tradition as well. And just as Jibreel or Gabriel informed Mary of these events, he is also the angel who communicates the Quran to Muhammad through divine dictation. So Gabriel or Jibreel is the most important angel in the Islamic tradition. There are many other angels, though. Michael is mentioned by name in the Quran as well. And we can see some references to these different types of revelation in the verses of the Quran. For example, this one from Surah 28, verse 7 says, so we, and who's the we here? The we is Allah, right? Speaking in the first person plural, the royal we. So we, Allah, sent this inspiration to the mother of Moses. So the mother of Moses didn't receive divine revelation in the sense of dictation, not a scripture, but this is the part of the story where Moses' mother puts the infant Moses into the basket into the river. So it's saying that this is where God plants that idea into her head, and she does it. So that's a kind of inspiration. But the Quran isn't understood to just be inspiration. Instead, the Quran falls under this category of divine dictation. That the Quran is dictated word for word, letter for letter. And then this occurred through the angel Gabriel. So there's a famous hadith recorded in Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim. Those two collections of hadith are two of the 6 Sahih or authentic canonical collections in Sunni Islam. They're the heaviest in terms of credibility. Right? So if an alim is making a case for something and he's saying, okay, well, I've got these Quranic verses and I've got these hadiths, if he's citing a hadith from Bukhari or Muslim, he's making a strong case. Whereas if someone else is like, I'm citing Tirmizi and An-Nisa'i, these are good sources, but they're not as good as Bukhari and Muslim. So there's this hadith in both Bukhari and Muslim called the hadith of Gabriel. It's probably the most important hadith that there is. And it tells the story of the angel Gabriel appearing to Muhammad and sitting down in front of him, knee to knee. And Gabriel asks Muhammad these questions, and Gabriel has appeared in the form of a man with a white robe and black hair. And he asks Muhammad, what is Islam? And Muhammad's response is what we know today as the 5 pillars of Islam. He goes through them. Testimony of faith, the 5 daily prayers, the paying the alms to the poor, fasting in Ramadan, and the Hajj. 5 pillars. It's the core of Islam. And Gabriel responds, you have answered correctly. And then he asks Muhammad, what is Iman? And the word Iman in Arabic, not to be confused with Imam. Imam means leader. Iman with an N or Nun means faith, belief. Muhammad responds by articulating the 6 core articles of belief. And that's a stepping stone for theology, the subject of our lecture today. So if Allah speaks to humanity through wahi, through revelation that can be transmitted in multiple forms, who are the recipients? Well, the Quran uses these two words that we'll see in translation once we begin reading the Quran this coming weekend. The Arabic words are Rasul and Nabi. And if you know the Hebrew word for prophet, Nabi, you recognize Nabi. It's basically a cognate. So these words are conventionally translated as messenger and prophet. Sometimes Rasul instead of messenger is translated as apostle. And so the Quran uses these terms, messenger and prophet or apostle, throughout the text. And names many of these prophets throughout the text. I think there's 25. I believe there's 25 prophets mentioned explicitly by name, but that also depends on who you consider to be a prophet. There are some people that Muslim scholars disagree as to whether or not they're a prophet or just a saint. For example, a figure like Luqman, there's a surah in the Quran named after Luqman. Luqman is generally considered to be a saint, a holy man, but not a prophet. Likewise, the majority of Muslim scholars would say Virgin Mary is not a prophet. But there are some Muslim scholars who say that she is. Everyone agrees that she's a saint. Is she a prophet? That's an issue that most would say no. So generally there's like 25 by name. And when it comes to the Quran itself, these terms, Rasul and Nabi, seem to be used interchangeably, like they're synonyms for each other. But over the centuries, Muslim scholars have theorized that there's a distinction between the two. And so they try to explain the difference between a Rasul and a Nabi. And not all of them agree, but I would say that the prevailing view is that a Rasul is a special class of prophets. It's a higher class. So you could think of it this way, that every Rasul is a Nabi, every messenger is a prophet, but every Nabi or prophet is not a Rasul. So the broad category of prophet is Nabi. And then there's a kind of special elite form of prophet, which is the Rasul. And notice that in the Shahada, the creed of faith in Islam, it says, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. So they use the word the Rasul in the Shahada, basic creed, the first pillar of Islam. I see a question has come in. Are there any female prophets? So the prevailing view is that women are the mothers of the prophets. So they would look to, for example, someone like the Virgin Mary, and that her special capacity is as the mother of Isa al-Masih, or Jesus Christ. And so the majority of Muslim scholars say that women are not prophets, they're the mothers of the prophets. But like I said, there are a few who would say that women can be prophets. There are certainly female saints, most definitely. But prophethood is generally restricted to men in the Islamic tradition. So Muslim theology says that every nation, every people on earth at one time received a Nabi, the broader category of prophet. And that this Nabi communicates monotheism and the judgment day. That you need to believe in the one God and act appropriately, because one day the world will end as we know it, and everyone will be resurrected and be held accountable by the one God, and you'll go either to the good place or to the bad place. That's kind of like the fundamental tenet that all the prophets throughout the world have ever communicated. And so in a hadith, there's a saying which the prophet says that there have been, I believe the number is 114,000 prophets throughout human history, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. And that long chain concludes with Muhammad. So Muhammad is called the seal of the prophets. He's the last prophet. So prophethood ends with Muhammad, and that means that the revelation that he brings, the Quran, is the last revelation. So what's next for humanity? Day of judgment. We await the coming of the day of judgment. So another question has come in. Would this distinction be similar to Christianity's major versus minor prophets? Yes, I think, yeah, I would say there's a very similar understanding going on here. Right? That you have what we could call the minor prophets is the Nabi, who have this global function to all the nations on the earth, but then there's this special group, those categorized as the messengers, as a Rasul, who play a special role in communicating dictated divine revelation that would take the form of holy books, and thus the formation of the religion of the one God, what's called Islam. And I'm not saying Islam here in the sense of the religion that Muhammad started. Islam in the literal meaning of submission or surrender. The Quran describes Islam as being the religion of all the prophets, not in the sense that they went to Mecca and did the pilgrimage or something like that, just in the sense that Islam and the idea of submitting to the will of the one God. So the Quran talks about all the prophets as being Muslim in the sense of people who submit to the will of the one God as being monotheists. Not in the sense that, the Quran isn't saying Moses went to Mecca. No, that's not part of it, right? He didn't do Hajj and those types of things. So this long line of prophets concludes with Muhammad, the seal of the prophets. He's it. So if you look at Muslim societies today, if a new religious movement begins, take the Baha'i faith in Iran, for example, or the Ahmadiyya in India, Pakistan. If a new religious movement begins that claims that they have a new prophet, that's extremely controversial. You want to be labeled a heretic, a blasphemer in a Muslim country quick, claim that you follow a new prophet after Muhammad. It's one thing to follow one of the older religions, right? Okay, the Christians, they're following their older religion, and the Jews, they're following their older religion. But for someone to claim that a religion comes after Islam, that there's a new revelation after the Quran, a new prophet, that is extremely controversial and contentious. So in, for example, Iran, where you have a 12 or Shia republic, it's legal to practice Christianity, it's legal to practice Judaism, it's even legal to practice Zoroastrianism. It is not legal to be a member of the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith started in the 19th century and claimed a new prophet with new revelation. No legal status there. Why? Because Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. He's the end. Now, Muhammad wasn't just a Nabi, according to Muslim scholars. He was also a Rasul, right? And I mentioned that in Shahada is called Rasulullah, the messenger of God. So both Sunni and Shia scholars traditionally identify a special set. These aren't the only Rasuls. There are others as well. But there's 5 who are seen as especially important, like the most important prophets for the establishment of the religion of Islam in the world. One of them is Muhammad, of course, but the others are Jesus or Isa, Moses or Musa, Abraham or Ibrahim, and Noah or Nuh. So sometimes these are called the 5 great prophets, and they are both a Nabi and a Rasul. This is a verse from Surah 42 of the Quran that names these 5 together. It says the same religion, and the word to be translated as religion here is deen in Arabic, the same deen or religion. He has established for you. The he here is Allah speaking in the third person. The you here is Muhammad. So the same religion he has established for you, Muhammad, he enjoined on Noah, and what he enjoined on Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, namely that you should remain steadfast in your deen, in the religion, and make no divisions therein. So this verse reflects that idea that all the prophets were Muslims, not in the historical sense, but in the theological sense. This idea of Islam is synonymous with monotheism, religion of tawheed, of divine unity, of divine oneness. So Muhammad, I think we know, Muslims believe is the prophet who receives the Quran, which we're studying in this course. But Muslims believe that there were earlier prophets, messengers, who received divinely dictated revelations as well. earlier holy books. And the Quran refers to at least 5 of those by name. The Quran refers to the existence of the Suhuf Ibrahim, the pages or the book of Abraham. And you say, well, what book are we talking about here? Well, the general view is that over the centuries, these divine revelations are lost, are corrupted, are changed by human beings. So God has to send another prophet with another divine book, right? Culminating with Muhammad and the Quran. And the Quran is the last revelation, and it gets preserved, unlike earlier revelations that may have been corrupted. So the Suhuf Ibrahim, Abraham's text, is lost to us. Then we have the Torah revealed to Musa, which we can broadly identify with the Torah, the first 5 books of the Tanakh, or what Christians call the Old Testament. Muslims believe that while the Torah as it exists today is in origin divine revelation from the one God to the prophet Moses, that over the generations and time, the text has become corrupted and altered. They would say the same about the Zabur, revealed to the prophet Dawood or David, as in King David. This is what we call the Psalms. And that the prophet Isa communicated a divine revelation known as the Injil, which is derived from the word evangel, as in the Gospels, the good news. But the books of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John in the New Testament, or the New Testament as a whole, that's not the Injil of Jesus. If we were to identify any part of the New Testament as the Injil of Jesus, it would have to be the quotations of Jesus, that which Jesus communicated to his followers. So perhaps something like the Sermon on the Mount would be part of the Injil, but the biographical details of Jesus's life or the story of the apostles and the Pentecost and the book of Acts, none of that would be part of the Injil, right? This is only what the prophet Jesus communicated to his followers. And then we get the Quran, right? The recitation communicated to the prophet Muhammad. So Muslims believe these are all examples of divine revelation, but it's only the Quran that can really be truly trusted, right? It's the most recent, it's divinely protected, and we'll talk more about what it means to say the Quran is divinely protected. And so it abrogates and supersedes all earlier revelations. So what does it mean to say that the Quran was protected, preserved in a way that earlier revelations weren't? Well, within the Quran, there are a number of verses that refer to something called the al-Kitab, or the Lawh al-Mahfuz. Al-Kitab could mean the source of the book, or even the mother of the book. Means mother or source. Lawh al-Mahfuz means the preserved tablet. So what do these phrases refer to? Well, Muslim interpreters of the Quran say that the mother of the book, or the source of the book, the preserved tablet, these terms, which are synonyms for each other, refer to a kind of divine prototype of the Quran that resides outside of this world, in the heavens. To use a modern analogy, it's like a backup disk, right? A backup drive. So that at any time during the life of Muhammad in which the Quran was threatened, something was misunderstood, something was forgotten, you got the backup drive there. And so Allah just recommunicates that, protects it from being lost, like a backup file. But that has to do immediately with the life of Muhammad. What happens after Muhammad dies in 632? Right? He's buried, dies like a human being, like anyone else, in Medina, can go and visit his grave. So what about what happens afterwards? Well, many Muslims would say that the Quran is still protected even after Muhammad's death. Not in the sense that you can't take an individual Quran and start like cutting it up or erasing verses and things like that, but in the sense that the true Quran continues to exist in the world. So while an individual scribe could make an error while writing it down, or someone could mispronounce it, maybe recite verses out of order, that doesn't preclude the existence of the true Quran in the world still. And so it continues to exist. Right? So here are some of those verses in the Quran that talk about this divine prototype, as it were. No, indeed, it is a glorious Quran in a preserved tablet. No, indeed, it is the glorious Quran in a preserved tablet. So these types of references, right, Muslim scholars get interested in, well, what is that preserved tablet? Is there literally like a big heavenly book up there that has the Quran written in it already? And it's just a matter of kind of like downloading it? Okay, they didn't use the word download, but you know what I mean. Here's another one. Verily we, that's the royal we, Allah speaking, have made it an Arabic Quran. This is a really interesting turn of phrase here for a theological debate that we'll talk about at the end of the lecture. Ja'alnahu. We have made it an Arabic Quran, so that you might understand. And verily it is in the mother of the book, the al-Kitab, before us, indeed exalted wise. So what is this mother of the book? So this seems to be some kind of divine prototype, but you see that this passage also refers to the existence of an Arabic recitation, an Arabic Quran. So later Muslim theologians will have to try and understand what is the relationship between the Arabic recitation, the Arabic Quran, and this divine form. And what's the relationship of the divine form to God himself? These are all things that Muslim scholars are going to try and figure out. Although some will be like, don't even think about it. Just leave it alone. Just accept what's on the page and don't speculate. This last verse. Allah blots out what he wills and confirms what he wills. And with him is the mother of the book. This refers to abrogation. We talked about abrogation last time. Right? The idea that there are certain parts of the Quran that are replaced by others. We even talked about the really peculiar example of the alleged verse of stoning that ceases to exist in the Quran, but the ruling still applies, so it overrides the verse of the Quran that says flogging for adulterers. So the reason why Muslims are so concerned with this idea of the Quran being preserved is, again, because of this idea that Muhammad is the last prophet. The Quran is all we have. It's it. There won't be another prophet to give a new revelation to correct where people have gone wrong. So this is a very important idea. And it's one of the reasons why the academic study of the Quran, a class like this, where we're talking about how the Quran took shape, and perhaps talking about differences in the way in which the Quran was written, the idea that the Quran could at all be a fluid text is something that's very controversial. Because it suggests then that perhaps the Quran went through some changes over time. So it's a very contentious topic, very controversial. In the vast majority of Muslim majority countries, you don't have academic study of the Quran the way that we have academic study of the Bible. And many Christians and Jews are threatened by academic study of the Bible. Others are completely okay with it. But the idea of academic study of the Quran is something that's really in its infancy when it comes to the Muslim majority world. You have to go to countries that are majority non-Muslim to find this type of academic analysis. Countries like Germany are some of the pioneers in the academic study of the Quran. So the idea that the Quran is protected is something that is found within the pages of the Quran itself. And I've given you two examples here, one from Surah 56, another from Surah 15. It says, it is a noble Quran, right? The literal meaning of the word Quran is recitation. So it is a noble recitation in a well-protected book, well-protected. This revelation given to Muhammad is preserved and protected. It's safeguarded from corruption. Here the Quran is described as the reminder. Verily, we sent down the reminder and we will preserve it. The Quran is preserved and safeguarded by God. There's a hadith that actually says that Muhammad used to have to recite the entirety of the Quran to the angel Gabriel once a year to confirm that he knew it all correctly. And then in the year of Muhammad's death, Gabriel asked him to recite it not once but twice. And so that was considered to be an omen of his coming death. That's a hadith. So this idea that God protects the Quran is something that Muslims believe has continued throughout history, although, as I said before, that doesn't mean that an individual scribe could make a typo and other errors like that. That can certainly occur, but the true Quran will continue to exist in the world. So throughout the pages of the Quran, Allah, the God, is referred to by many different names. And there's a hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, where he says, verily Allah has 99 names. 99 names of Allah. If you visit a mosque, you may see a poster, some other framework of art that lists the 99 names written in beautiful Arabic calligraphy. That's common. So we find names like El-Wadud, which means the loving one. El-Ghafar, which means the forgiving one. El-Alim, the knowing one. El-Rahman, the merciful one. These are some of the 99 names of God. These names correspond to Allah's characteristics. So if we call Allah El-Ghafar, forgiving one, that corresponds to the fact that he's forgiving, right? Describes a quality of God. If we call him El-Alim, the knowing one, corresponds to his knowledge, right? That he has these features. That this transcendent God, who is beyond human conception, can at least be known on some level by his attributes, and his attributes are cited by these names. So this raises a theological dilemma. If Allah is referred to by all these different names, do these names correspond to something distinct about Allah? Let me see if I can phrase this better. So if, for example, Allah is called El-Ghafar, the forgiving one, that name must correspond to something about God that is distinct and different from some other part of God, that is his mercy, his wrath, his sight, his hearing, his speech. Otherwise, these words don't mean anything, right? We could refer to God's sight by referring to his knowledge, right? The different words must correspond to different things. Different signifiers must correspond to something signified. You say, okay, all right. Why is that a problem? Well, if the whole core of Islam is the formula, La ilaha illallah, there's no deity but God. There's only one God. If you start talking about the existence of these different pieces of God, his sight, his hearing, his mercy, suddenly God becomes pieces, multiplicity, no longer one. That's a problem. So Muslim scholars were concerned about this. Are we violating monotheism by emphasizing the existence of these different attributes? Are they things that exist? If they don't exist, what are we to make of the words used in the Quran? So there were different responses to this. And depending on your response to the problem of God's attributes, that had a big impact on how you understood the Quran. Not just in its content, its existence. What is the Quran? What is the Quran's nature? Here's just some examples of the use of words corresponding to attributes. There are three different forms of tawheed or monotheism in Islamic theology and Islamic thought. There's tawheed al-uluhiyya, the oneness of God in godhood, basically. Tawheed al-rububiyyah, the oneness of God in his lordship. And then there is tawheed al-asma wa sifat, the unity of his names and attributes. So it's a third category of tawheed, of God's oneness, that is the focus here. So we see in the pages of the Quran verses like this. This is from Surah 20, verse 8. God, there is no God but him. To him belong al-isma al-husna, the best names. God's names correspond to his attributes. And it says here in Surah 17, call upon Allah or El-Rahman, the merciful one. Whichever name you call on, to him belong the best names. Surah 15, inform my servants that I am, here we see the use of the I instead of the we, a more intimate, El-Ghafar, the forgiving one, Al-Rahim, the compassionate one. So these names correspond to these attributes. Well, it turns out that one of those attributes is speech. Just as God is seeing, is hearing, is knowing, he's also speaking. Now, we started off the lecture today, I said, Muslims believe the Quran is the word of God. That's a common English expression. I could also render it as the speech of God. Well, speaking is one of God's attributes. So Muslims believe that the Quran was dictated word for word, letter for letter in Arabic to the Prophet Muhammad, who communicated it to his followers, who then wrote it down and compiled it into the book that we know today as the Quran. So if the Quran is the speech of Allah and speaking is one of Allah's attributes, is the Quran God's attribute of speech? Because if it is, God's attributes are qualities of him, and God is eternal, unceasing. And his attributes, like his sight, his knowledge, his love, his mercy, all of these things must be eternal as well. So if we identify the Quran as God's speech, the word of God, with his attribute of speaking, does that mean that the Quran then is eternal and uncreated, without beginning? That changes how we understand this book, right? This is something quite remarkable. And if we agree that, okay, yeah, the Quran is God's speech, so it's uncreated, what does that mean for a book? This isn't the Quran, but just for example, the book that I can hold in my hand. Because the written Quran, the Uthmanic Codex that we have, guess what? You can open it up and I can say, start at the beginning. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. It has a beginning. It has a start. So how can the physical book have a beginning and an end, start and finish, and be the unceasing, uncreated speech of God? How do we reconcile those two things? That's where theology takes over. That's where I said it gets complicated. It gets mind-numbingly complicated. And you think, aren't there more important things to worry about in the world than these nuances? Well, for some of the scholars, this is their job, right? Is to explore these things. So let me try and summarize some of the different views regarding the nature of the Quran, whether it's created, uncreated, what's its relationship to God's attributes. Because the belief in the attributes seemed potentially like it could violate monotheism, right? By taking the one God and breaking him up into pieces. Like this is his sight, and this is his hearing, and this is his speech, into pieces. There were some Muslim scholars in the early centuries that said, you know what? That's a violation of monotheism, and monotheism is what our whole religion is based upon. So we reject the existence of the attributes. We don't believe that they exist because they imply multiplicity. So anything that violates monotheism, that must be an incorrect understanding. So instead, they argued that it's not that the attributes are things which subsist in God. Rather, they are just qualities that human beings in our limited capacity perceive of God, not that they are actual things as such. So that's one camp. And if you don't believe in the existence of the attributes, then the Quran isn't God's eternal attribute of speech. So for the group that deny the existence of the attributes, they say that the Quran is created. The Quran is created. Now, which is not to say that the Quran is somehow less than. It just means that the Quran is created just like the earth is created. So God created the Quran within space-time, just like he created human beings and he created the earth. So that is a product of denying the existence of the attributes. That is not the majority position. The majority position, the position that would win out for most Muslims, is to affirm the existence of the attributes. They say, yeah, the attributes do exist. And you say, well, wait, does that break God into pieces? They say, nope. They subsist in his divine essence. They are neither he nor other than he. And I laugh because those clever expressions, you say, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, don't ask any further questions. It's like there's a stopping point at some point, where you just go, okay. I guess they just turn to the idea that human beings can never fully comprehend it all, but they affirm the attributes, but they say, no, but God is in pieces because they subsist in the divine essence and they are neither he nor other than he. So they are one with him, but also discernible and distinctive from him. So we can still talk about the existence of his wrath as something different from his love, but they all are one at the same time. So the direct implication of affirming the attributes is you affirm the existence of God's speech. And if you affirm the existence of God's speech as an attribute, all his attributes, like God as a whole, are unceasing, eternal. And that means then that the Quran is uncreated. It's uncreated because it's God's speech. So this might seem like, who cares? This is all semantics. This was a big enough issue that during the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th century, there was a kind of inquisition in which the Abbasid caliphs tried to impose this doctrine on the ulama, on the scholars. They tried to impose the notion of the createdness against the scholars. The scholars who accepted the attributes and that the Quran was uncreated, the caliphs sided with the deniers of the attributes, and then the Mehna tried to impose it on the scholars. Sorry about that. So this distinction, although it may just seem like, oh, this is all intellectual, semantics and things like that, it was a big enough deal that the political authorities and the scholars in the classical age were in conflict over this. Because it has an impact on how we interpret the text. If the Quran is uncreated, then that changes how we understand the significance of history in interpreting the Quran. In essence, you could come to the view that the Quran doesn't contain responses to historical events. Instead, history unfolded in response to the Quran. That the Quran, for example, since time immemorial as God's speech, contained references to things like the Battle of Badr in 624. And so history then followed suit in order to manifest the Quran within space and time. So if you accept that the Quran is uncreated, it undermines interpretations that emphasize a historical context for the Quran. Not entirely, but somewhat. Whereas if you argue that the Quran is created, then you can contextualize the Quran more within history, within circumstance, and also perhaps have greater freedom and leeway in your interpretations of it. Now, for those Muslims who affirm the attributes, affirm that the Quran is uncreated, there's another split, just to keep it complicated for us. So in Sunni Islam, the Sunnis say that the Quran is uncreated because they believe in the attributes, they believe in the attribute of speech, therefore the Quran is uncreated. But then there's another issue. What about the Quran that we write with our hands? What about the Quran that we recite with our tongues, that we might even mispronounce? Is that the uncreated Quran, the eternal, unceasing speech of God? Well, a split would occur, where the Sunni theologians would begin to talk about the difference between God's unceasing, uncreated speech and the written, spoken manifestations of that unceasing speech, which can be flawed, which can be incorrect, right? That we can mispronounce words, that we can write, when a scribe writes the Quran, he can have a typo, all those types of things. And so they felt the necessity to draw a distinction between those two forms of the Quran. This is a diagram I put together to try and communicate the idea of denying the attributes. So in the realm of perception, in the physical world, the human beings perceive the attributes, but the attributes are not actually part of God. They're just things which are perceived, and thus the Quran is created because God does not have an eternal attribute of speech. And then here is my attempt at a representation of the attributes subsisting in God's essence. And this is the word al-kalam, the speech of God, and then entering into the world and materializing into the Arabic Quran. So here's what Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, writing in the 11th century, has to say about the Quran. Al-Juwayni is a Sunni Muslim. He's a theologian. And he writes in his book, Kitab al-Irshad, which means the book of guidance, those who believe in the eternity of the speech of the exalted God and its subsistence in the essence of the Creator, may he be sanctified and exalted, and the impossibility of its separating from that which it is attributed, will have no doubt at all about the impossibility of its being transposed. Can you imagine translating that from the classical Arabic, right? That's some lofty language. So what he's arguing here is that, yes, the attributes exist, the Quran is the speech of God, but what is transposed, what is what we write down in our hands and what we speak aloud, is created. So what we write down, what we speak fallibly as human beings is created. But the Quran itself is uncreated. It's God's speech. Now again, on the surface you think, this is semantics. Why does it even matter? To Muslim scholars, it did matter. And because other Sunnis who believed that you shouldn't make such a distinction deemed views like this to be satanic and evil. And they rejected them very strongly. I wrote about this in my doctoral dissertation. And you think, really? Your views aren't even very different. But just like Christians who denounced each other for being heretics because, one talked about the two natures of Christ, the divine and the human existing in one person, and others talked about the merger of those two human and divine natures, right? That's the difference between the Chalcedonian Christians like the Catholics and Orthodox and the so-called Monophysites like the Ethiopians and Coptic Christians. On the surface, you think it's all semantics. It doesn't even really matter. But to those communities themselves, it really does. And the same is true here. All these nuanced, subtle understandings of what the nature of the Quran is from a theological perspective. This is a description of the nature of the Quran, the differences between what is uncreated and unceasing and the physical manifestation of the Quran as articulated by Al-Ghazali. So Al-Ghazali is one of the greatest Muslim minds of all time. His brother was pretty smart too. And he was the student of Al-Juwayni, the aforementioned theologian. And in a treatise he wrote while he was at a spiritual retreat in Jerusalem, he stayed for a time at Al-Aqsa, beside the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and he composed this theological treatise called Al-Risala al-Qudsiyya. Jerusalem is called Medinat al-Quds, the holy city in Arabic. And Al-Ghazali writes, God Most High is speaking a speech which is sui generis, that is unique unto itself, unlike anything else. God's speech is neither sound nor letter. For his speech does not resemble that of any other, just as his existence does not resemble that of any other. Human speech is in reality that of the soul. Sounds are formed into letters merely as indicators. If you encounter one whose mind does not restrain him from saying, my tongue is created, but what it utters through my own created power, it's uncreated, do not entertain respect for his mind. So Ghazali is criticizing some other Sunnis who are saying, yeah, my tongue is created, but the words, when I recite the Quran, that's uncreated. Ghazali is saying, no, that's wrong. At any time a created being like a human being is reciting the Quran or writing the Quran, that manifestation of the Quran is created. And that the uncreated part of the Quran is neither sound nor letter. Because God's speech is unlike any other speech. It's sui generis. It's unique. When we think of speech like, Professor Alberson is speaking and boring us to tears in the classroom, that this speech is completely different from God's speech. He says, for his speech does not resemble that of any other, just as his existence is unique, right? There's no other being out there that is like God. So he's saying, similarly, the speech of God is unlike anything else. And so Ghazali, who some people describe as like the greatest Muslim mind after Muhammad, talks about this important nuanced distinction. Saying, yeah, the Quran is uncreated, but the uncreated Quran is beyond sound and letter. Once that Quran manifests in sound and letter, that's created. Now, critics of this view would say, you guys are just like the ones who denied the attributes to begin with, because they say that the Quran is created, and when they talk about that, they're talking about the Quran in sound and letter. So again, it's all these highly nuanced positions, all about trying to reconcile what it means to have this physical book and to identify it as the Word of God, God's speech, the last revelation given to humanity through the Prophet Muhammad. So Ghazali and Juwayni both represent the Asharite school of Sunni theology. In Sunni Islam, there are two schools, two denominations of theology. The Asharites, represented here, they're named after Abul Hassan al-Ashari, who died in the year 935. And then there's another school called the Matrides. The Matridi school developed in Central Asia and spread among the Hanafi school of law in Sunni Islam. So wherever Hanafi Islam went, so did the Matridi school. And the Ottoman Empire, one of the great empires of Islamic history, was a Sunni empire, yes, but it was also a Hanafi Matridi empire. So in Sunni Islam, it's acceptable to either be an Ashari or a Matridi. Their theology has some differences between them, but they're very similar. Now, there are some Sunnis who reject both of those schools of theology. They think theology is corrupting, even satanic, because they think, hey, these are human beings introducing all these lofty ideas, maybe even borrowing from the pagan Greeks, right, with their philosophical ideas to make sense of the Quran and so forth. So you should just abandon theology as a whole. That group is called the Athariya. And they are what we could describe as literalists. You just accept whatever's on the page, bila kayf, without asking how. So in my last lecture, we talked about how the Quran refers to God's throne or God's hand or God's face. The Athariya, these anti-theological Sunnis, would say, if the Quran says God has a hand, then God has a hand. Leave it at that, bila kayf. Don't speculate as to whether or not it's a metaphor for something. Just accept it as it is. That was not the approach of Ghazali and Juwayni and these theological intellectuals. Instead, they talk about how, yes, the attributes exist. God's speech is uncreated. The Quran is God's uncreated speech, but the written or spoken Arabic Quran, this manifestation in letter and sound, is created. And the analogy is made that when you're thinking about what you want to say, you first have an idea in your head before you speak it or you write it down. So what's in a human being's head before they speak it or write it down is like the true uncreated of the Quran. And then once you speak it or write it down, and you may stutter, you may mispronounce something, that's created. Yeah, Anthony.
So what do Muslims think about like the Quran as related by Gabriel? Because if Gabriel spoke it into being, he created God, if it's inseparable.
In the sense of it being a manifestation?
Yes.
It's a good question. So I think there's two issues there. One is I think as soon as the Quran materializes in the form of sound or letter, then it's the created Quran. Okay? So the Quran, as Muhammad receives it in terms of sound, what he heard, what he spoke aloud, is created. But then there's the question as to whether or not Gabriel's communication with Muhammad was actually in the realm of sound, in the sense that Muhammad received it, and we know it as sound or letter. Right. But did anyone else hear those words or their sounds, right? Did that manifestation take place? But I think whenever the manifestation takes place as sound or letter, it becomes created in this view. In terms of that transmission point between Gabriel and Muhammad, depends on how the communication took place. Yeah. It's a good question. And I haven't seen a theologian explicitly write about that interaction. So that would be interesting to explore further. This is an example of the contrary view in Sunni Islam. Those who said, hey, don't engage in all this speculation. Just accept it how it is and stay out of it. This is attributed to Ahmed ibn Hanbal, who's the namesake of one of the 4 schools of practice in Sunni Islam. And the sect in Saudi Arabia today called Wahhabism traces its roots to him. So they come out of his school of law. So when you're thinking about different types of Islam that exist in the world and how some are stricter than others, Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia is particularly strict. They come out of this anti-theological school of thought. The quote says, the Quran is God's speech, which he expressed. It is uncreated. And he who says the Quran is God's speech and stops there without adding uncreated speaks even more abominably than an infidel. He who maintains that our sounds, which render the Quran and our recitation are created, is a heretic. And he who does not declare all those people infidels is like them. God spoke to Moses with his mouth and put the Torah into his hand with his own hand. And you can see the anthropomorphic literalism going on there. Talking about God is like having a mouth, an uttering facility. And the theologians would really react against this because they say God doesn't have a mouth. He doesn't have a tongue. It's not like his creation. So to say that God has these things is blasphemous for their point of view. And by the way, this Ahmed ibn Hanbal was persecuted by the Abbasid caliphs during that Inquisition period that I bumbled through. I tried to explain, but I got it backwards at first. He was one of the persecuted because he had these anthropomorphic views. Nathan has a question. Because of God's speech and the sound of God, is that why the Quran can be written and read in other languages besides Arabic? I've read that some religions it is frowned upon to use other languages. Yes, Nathan. So the Quran is only considered to be the Quran in the original Arabic. So it's fine to have a translation to try and understand the meaning of the Quran because it's like reading a commentary. But when it comes to reciting the Quran, for example, during prayers, it's always done in Arabic. So even, let's say you're an American Muslim, you've grown up speaking English your entire life, and you can't understand Arabic, you're still going to memorize part of the Quran phonetically because the sound is sacred. It's sacred sound. It's chosen by God, not Muhammad or someone else. And so you recite the Quran in Arabic still. So the Quran is only really the Quran in Arabic, and translations are allowed, but they are more like commentaries on the meaning of the Quran than the Quran as such. I hope that makes sense. Now, I didn't want to conclude this lecture without talking just a little bit about Shia Islam. So there is this distinction not only in Shia theology, but also in Sunni theology, about 2 different types of attributes. So let's say, okay, we accept the existence of the divine attributes. Theologians say, in the Islamic tradition, that there are some attributes that are always going on. They're unceasing, like God's knowledge, his sight, his hearing. But there are some attributes like his wrath, that are relational. That is, these attributes only exist in relation to something else. So, for example, God is not eternally wrathful. His wrath manifests when he's punishing someone. Let's say Pharaoh in Egypt. So there are two different types of attributes according to these theologians. There are essential attributes, attributes of God's essence, which are eternal. And then there are attributes of act, which are relational. Right? So if God isn't angry at anyone, then his wrath isn't there, right? It manifests in relation to something which earns his wrath. So in Sunni Islam, speech is considered an essential attribute. It's part of him. It's always there. That's why I didn't get into the distinction there. In Shia Islam, they say, and I'm talking about 12ers, because 12ers are the majority, they say that, okay, God has attributes, but speech is not one of his essential attributes. So it's not always there. It's relational. And it makes sense. It's like a persuasive argument, right? Because you think, well, when is God speaking? Well, he's speaking when he has a prophet to speak to. Well, what if there's no prophet or messenger? What's the nature of God's speech? And you could go off in theological directions to be like, well, it emanates through the universe or something like that, right? But you can understand how someone can make an argument that God's speech is relational because he's speaking to a prophet. So that's the position that the Shia take. And so because of that, the Shia believe that the Quran is created. So the Sunnis say Quran is uncreated, albeit some say leave it there, others say uncreated, but the words and the sounds, that's created. The Shia say Quran is created, period. Why? Because God's speech is a relational attribute. It's not an essential attribute. So this is a 10th century articulation of that understanding of the Quran according to the Shia view. We do not say that he, the glorious and mighty, has always been the great creator, the one possessed of action, will, and intention, the approver, the disapprover, the provider, the bountiful one, the speaker, because these are the attributes of his actions, and therefore they are created. So you want to add another detail to the differences between the Sunni and the Shia. Sunni, the Quran is uncreated. The Shia say the Quran is created. In practical implications, does it make a huge deal of difference? Not really. Like I said, if you believe the Quran is created, then you're talking about how the Quran was created at a particular moment. And so it historicizes the text more than if you argue that the Quran is uncreated. But just because you argue the Quran is uncreated doesn't completely strip it of historical context either, especially if you argue that the written, spoken Quran is created. Right? Then you're just sort of like nodding to the uncreated nature of the Quran. But yeah, so those are some of the differences in the theology of the Quran. So again, from the Muslim point of view, the Quran isn't inspired by God in the sense that these are Muhammad's words coming from a kind of divine inspiration where Muhammad chose his own words. Instead, Muslims understand the Quran as being dictated word for word, letter for letter by God, to the point in which they debate about whether or not the Quran is eternal, unceasing, and uncreated altogether, with different views regarding how we should understand that. So when we think about this common phrase, the word of God, Muslims really push this whole idea of having a holy book as the word of God to its like extreme limits, right? It's taken in a very literal sense. Muslims aren't the first to do this. I mean, the traditional view in Judaism, in Orthodox Judaism, the Torah was the same way. Now, Judaism over time has developed various Reform traditions, and some branches of Judaism don't have that view, like Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism. But traditionally, that was the view. And so the Muslim understanding of the Quran is reminiscent of the way that Jews once, and some still do, understood the Torah as divinely dictated. There's some similarities there too with how Hindus understand the Vedas. So the ancient Vedas are understood to be sacred sound and to be communicated by the gods, not of human origin, but from the gods to the rishis, these ancient sages as well. Questions? So we have a lighter subject next time. The Quran is ritual object, which is a fun topic because it's about how, since the Quran is believed to be God's uncreated speech, right? It makes the physical object this holy object, and it becomes like a talisman, an amulet. So next time we'll talk about how, aside from the content of the Quran is a physical object, what role it plays in Muslim day-to-day life. And we'll talk about practices such as writing verses of the Quran on a piece of paper and then soaking it in water, so the ink then bleeds into the water. And because the ink was used to write God's speech, it becomes sacred. And then the water becomes sacred, and then people will do things like drink the water as a kind of holy water to take in God's speech into their bodies. Really interesting ritual practices and things like that. So that'll be our topic next time. Read the Farid Isak article, which will talk about some of that stuff in preparation for class on Thursday. All right, and thank you again for your response papers. I'll be reading those over the next couple of days. All right, that is all for today.